So we're going to start actually with a very early painting in our collection from 1982 to 1985, which I was really surprised to find out that we owned because I actually didn't know that we owned it. It's from a small group of paintings. I think there's 3 or 4 of them, and this is considered to be a study. Could you talk a little bit about what you were doing at this point in your career and what these paintings, what you were exploring here?
I heard in the mid to late 70s, maybe around 78, 76, I heard architects speaking about postmodernism, and they were experimenting in the ugliest buildings in the world with postmodernism. It's the ugliest buildings in New York, for sure. I didn't believe modernism had passed, so I did this series of paintings as an experiment. This is a study for what turned out to be a 64 painting, a large painting. It's called the Bruegel series because the painting is taken from Bruegel, a vanitas of style. This is the original painting, Bruegel painting, was a vanitas painting. Vanitas means they were religious paintings, like Pilgrim's Progress, going through the vanity of life, really. And each painting, each flower in the painting was a symbol of vanity, but not vanity looking in the mirror and saying, oh, aren't I lovely, but vanity in vain, life in vain, action in vain, vanities of style. So I chose that to investigate modernism and postmodernism. And it took 4 years of studies and 2 years to do the actual painting. Can we see the next? This is the actual painting. It's, I think, 20 feet high and 16 feet wide. I think it's, 64 paintings, small paintings. Each painting is in a different style of a different artist. And I had a lot of fun researching it because I could look at paintings of artists that I admired and didn't admire. It starts with a 14th century German painting in the your lower left, and it ends with Jackson Pollock somewhere near the top. It includes Friends, Cubism, which I had the most trouble with understanding how it was constructed, and Van Gogh and all the Impressionists.
That's great. We have a wonderful program here at the Hirshhorn where whenever we have an artist in the building, we try to interview them if they have a work in our collection to try to learn more about it. And Pat was kind enough to let our conservators interview her a couple weeks ago when we were installing the show. And I think it had been several decades since you saw that painting.
Yes.
What were you surprised by? What was it like seeing that painting 2 decades, 3 decades later?
I loved it less than when I did it.
That's not what I heard from the conservators, but okay, fair game. That's fair. So,
but I love this one a lot.
Yeah. Well, I like the Hirshhorn one as well. So, shifting gears, a few years after you made this painting, you had a major shift in your working process. You started to, instead of just brushing with a brush, you would begin to drip and pour and throw paint directly on the canvas. And part of this was, as I understand it, driven by your study of Chinese ink painting and Taoist philosophy. Would you talk about what prompted that shift a bit?
It was more of a permutation. When I did this painting, I discovered Japanism and when I discovered Japanism, then I discovered Japanese brush. I went to Japan and discovered Japanese brush and calligraphy painting. Then I got interested in Chinese painting. There's a kind of painting that they call water mountain painting, the literatis, which is later. Painted a landscape, but they didn't sit in the landscape and paint. They sat in the landscape and meditated on the landscape. And they let the landscape pass through them and came home or wherever they went and made paintings, landscape paintings. And these beautiful paintings, I'm sure everyone has seen, of huge landscapes and in it is a monk this big, like an eighth of an inch tall, half an inch tall. And the landscape is huge. The landscape represents the universe, and the monk is the person's presence in it, how small we are in the whole big universe. And from that came studying meditation and reading and learning more about Chinese painting, particularly Chinese painting.
And around the same time, after you started making paintings like this, there were several years where you made exclusively white on black paintings, monochromes. I wouldn't call them monochromes, but two-color paintings. And I think this is an important point because I think it points to the way you set very strict parameters for yourself when you're making paintings that aren't always visible. Could you talk about why you do that?
Well, they're not black and white. There are many colors of black and many colors of white. They're not simply black and white. And
all right. Ouch.
Here you can see where the white paint on top of the black becomes transparent. It becomes a different color.
And then there's gray, I can see.
Yeah.
So I caught.
But this painting is at the Whitney Museum, and it's all thrown paint. This one is also thrown paint. I stood on a ladder and made a wave gesture and threw the paint at the canvas. I never dripped paint. I poured it or threw it.
No dripping.
Dripping is not macho enough for me.
I mean, I think one of the things about that process is the fact, I mean, for decades you've been working this way, and you have a really incredible understanding of how the ratio of pigment to oil impacts impacts your work, and you have a very good sense in many ways as to what might happen on the canvas. But chance is still a very important part of the paintings. And are there things that surprise you sometimes when you make the paintings? And when is there too much chance? When is it too out of your control?
The paintings that are too out of my control, you never see. I learned about chance from John Cage and Merce Cunningham. Using chance, everything is chance, of course, but openly using chance, I learned from them. And it's wonderful because I would pour the paint at night, and in the morning go in and say to Sean, my assistant, "Look what the paint did last night." And it's a wonderful experience because I'm not to blame. The paint did it. I didn't do it. It's a great experience. And a few months ago, I did a set for the centennial, Merce Cunningham centennial. It was a video, and it was projected. And I did it Merce's way, which is I didn't look at any rehearsals. I just knew when it began and when they began and when they ended it. And I did my things separately on my own. And when they put it together and showed it, it worked. And that was the magic of their chance means. Magically, it always worked for them. And it works often for me.
I mean, I think speaking about the chance, I've read articles where you've spoken about taking yourself out of those paintings, and chance does that to a certain point. And I think earlier when you spoke to our staff, you spoke about expression, and you can never get all the expression out. Can you talk about that interest in taking yourself out and how you can never get expression absolutely out of the painting?
By pouring the paint or throwing the paint, I take myself out of the painting, but there's always intention and setting the limits. So I set the limits, and I intend to make a painting. So I'm not totally out of it, but I'm not using it to express myself. And I really believe that if you're suffering from a need for self-expression, you should see a therapist. You should talk it over. You shouldn't make art. Art, that's not the purpose of art, in my opinion.
Well, I think going back to that point, you were talking about some of the Chinese landscape painters, And in a recent article, there was a conversation between you and Kiki Smith that was just published online. And you made this comment, I'm making landscapes, but not landscape paintings. And there was another thing I had read in a catalog where you said, to make a painting, would this picture of light be what you call an abstract painting, or would it be a picture of reality? Do you know at what point an image is not an image? And it seems to me your paintings always sit right on that edge. They might have suggestions of landscape that you might project on, that your viewer might project onto it, but then they're also abstract.
I don't really know what abstract is. When people say it's an abstract painting, does that mean it's just color and it doesn't have a horizon line? Is it a landscape? I call them landscapes because of the size. I want the size to be so that when you look at it, you're not overly aware of the edges, rather than an easel painting where you see the rectangle of the painting. So it's just that simple. I think the scale makes it a landscape.
It's simply the scale.
Yeah.
Well, and it's that embodiment. I feel like especially with the paintings here, you stand in front of them and there's a very intense engagement with the body, I feel like, when you stand in front of those paintings. As you've probably noticed on some of these slides, there are a number of paintings that Pat has made over the last probably less than a decade, which are very different than the waterfalls, which are probably her most iconic paintings, which a lot of people are familiar with. There was a dramatic shift to a canvas that's subdivided into two, and it seemed to me there was this beautiful tension. They're extremely nuanced, not that the waterfalls weren't, but they were extremely nuanced in the colors. And it seemed like there was this kind of elusive materiality that seemed to me as much about light or as about matter. Could you talk about what made you shift away and start working in that way?
Oh, do they look different? I didn't.
To my eye, they do.
I don't think of it as a shift because I still make the waterfall paintings too. And this is also poured paint. In these paintings, these double image, double color paintings, they're poured, the paint is poured onto the canvas in the same way that the waterfall paint is, except they're closer together. There's more paint closer together. So at the beginning, it looks like the waterfall. It's just pressing it closer. I don't know if they're that different. They look different, but are they really different? I don't know.
Okay, let's shift to the Hirshhorn's project. Hopefully, many of you have had a chance to go upstairs and see that. And as Melissa mentioned, this is an opportunity for us to give artists a chance to respond to the Bunshaft building, because everybody wants to work in response to Gordon Bunshaft's architecture. Pat, could you talk a little bit about how you came up with the idea of a color wheel? And I think for me, what's most important is, I think we say color wheel and someone goes, oh yeah, color wheel, and it's a very kind of formal thing. It can be seen as a wheel, but what I've learned as you've been making these paintings over the last year, it's a very multi-layered conceptual project. And could you talk about how you came to the color wheel in the space and what these paintings mean in that space?
Well, I have this wonderful book of color wheels, except it's in German, and I can't read German, so I just look at the pictures. The circular gallery suggested a color wheel, and it was that simple, just inspired by how often does one get to have a circular gallery? Once I did a panorama, and that was a circle, but it was seascape, so it wasn't a color wheel. This was a wonderful opportunity to take an idea and work with it to make it. The paintings are all the same and not alike. So they take you around. You can see the color changing. Some of the colors are 4 layers of paint to make the color, and others are 11 layers. So they have a lot of paint on them. The color that you see is a result of many transparent layers poured on top of each other. So they're poured off a brush. So we start at the bottom and work our way up to the top, and it pours back down, and then that dries. Then the next layer goes on. And what color the next layer is based on the last layer and the idea of what color I want it to be in the end.
So it's a much more cumulative process, but I think a lot of people have asked me about how you made these paintings. Did you make them one at a time? Did you make them all at once?
All at once.
All at once.
I worked on them all at once because oil paint dries so slowly. So not all 30 at once, but in groups of 7, I think.
Right, in your studio, I saw them. So why did you start with red?
I like red.
But then I think one of the things Pat has told me several times is that purple is very difficult for her, which I would never guess from looking at those paintings, but I feel like you left yourself with purple at the end, and which was by the time you had made 28 paintings or 26 paintings, you had left yourself the most difficult paintings. Can you talk about that?
Well, I didn't leave them for myself, but I built the color wheel in a logical way. So I started with red, and the red became orange, the orange became yellow, the yellow became green, the green became blue, the blue became purple. So I just I ate my way to purple.
But you can go either way in this space. I need to make that very clear.
Yeah.
We've talked about that. There is no one way through those galleries. One of the things that I love about having these paintings in our circular galleries is the edges of the paintings are very obvious, and Pat doesn't tape off the edges of her paintings, and you can see some of the different colors that you used to achieve the final color, and almost all of them except for one, I think, start with green. And I'm not a painter, so I don't know how to make paintings, but I was surprised that one, you would start with the same color, and that you would start with green for every single painting. Could you talk about what that does, or why?
I start with green for all my paintings.
And why is that?
Well, you have to start with something. I can't just go make color on a white canvas. I just start with the color. And the traditional underpainting is a kind of sepia color, I think, that the Renaissance artists used, and that's how they get their dark and light. They build into the dark. That begins the dark. But I can't use a dark color because my paintings are light, bright colors. So green, this particular green pushes out light rather than darkness.
And looking at the composition of the paintings themselves, early on, you invited me to the studio to see a model to give me a sense of what you wanted to do. And I will say that as soon as I walked into the studio and I saw the model, I knew it was going to be fabulous because I immediately saw it and immediately understood the significance of it. What made you decide to do not just, but a single gesture on all of the paintings? Earlier iterations had more of a variation, and so what brought you to the decision that every painting should have a single gesture?
The gesture on every painting is its complementary color. So there are 2 color wheels, actually. There's a color wheel, the main color of the canvas, and then the gesture is a complementary color. And I felt that that's all you needed, that a more gestural painting wasn't necessary. And it was more clear with complementary color and more visually stunning in a way, visually easy to accept.
And to me, the fact that there's the same gesture or a similar gesture on all of the canvases, to me makes it clear this idea that you've been talking about for decades, which is this idea that gestural painting is a conceptual practice, and the idea that painting could be a gestural practice, which of course goes against many of the conventional ideas about painting and about conceptual art. And so I felt like when I walk around those galleries, since we got the paintings on the wall, I would hesitate to call it a summation because you have so many other things to make. But to me, it made some of your ideas that you've been working on and exploring for decades, they seem to suddenly have a clarity to my eye. And did you feel that way about the project?
Well, I feel that way about all the work I've been doing for the last 30 years, not before that, but for a long time. And that is, I got sick and tired of those people saying painting is dead. And especially in the 60s and early 70s, during the period of conceptual art, I was a young artist then, and I love to paint. Painting is the only form I know. And I wanted to prove painting can be, it isn't always, of course, but it's just a material. So can be a conceptual art as much as a chalkboard or video or whatever. It depends on the concept behind the work, not the material it's made in. I'm just tired of people saying painting is dead. It's not dead.
This is not the only installation that you've done over the last 2 years. You unveiled a marvelous project up in Philadelphia. She created a series of 11 paintings that went in the niches where the tapestries normally are in the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. And I think you did the right thing by deciding to try to get the Barnes project finished, and then you moved on to the Hirshhorn. I think at one point when I talked to you, you thought about going at the same time and changed your mind. But can you talk about the unique challenges that each of these projects had?
The only challenge was time. The Barnes project is all waterfall paintings, recently done to scale, because each niche in the wall was a different, they're no two the same size. I don't understand why architecturally, but anyway, that's how it is.
It's another postmodernist architect.
Yeah. Possibly. Anyway, I was very honored to do something at the Barnes. I grew up in a suburb of Philadelphia and spent my adolescence trying to get into the Barnes Museum. You had to make a reservation, and not just decide one morning to go. And they only let a few people in every week. It was very limited. So when I was invited to do that project, I was thrilled and honored and sort of said, see, I'm in.
Well, I think installation art is a through line of your practice over the decades. You've done many different types of installations. And I was interested in thinking about how you approach these multi-canvas installations differently than you might approach an exhibition in a gallery or another show, or even just discrete paintings. What were the challenges, and how did you approach these paintings differently, or these two projects differently?
I always think of my work in groups. So,
you do, always.
Yeah, so even if it's a gallery show, I think of a group of paintings rather than one painting, then another, and then another. I think of it as a group and to display and show a group.
So these were more of a designated space that they went into.
Yeah.
That kind of started the project in your mind.
Well, I actually paint for exhibitions too.
Right.
I very rarely randomly paint one painting. If I'm studying a form, yes, it's random just to study. But if it's for exhibition, I usually plan what's going to be seen together.
So you think about the architecture of the space before you start working on the paintings, as you did with ours?
Yes, because I tend to make my paintings so big, I have to know the size of the space.
You had a decades-long friendship with Agnes Martin. And I know that you began to visit her regularly back in the early 1970s. And I've read about how your first encounter with her was particularly meaningful. And we were talking about this during installation. Can you talk a little bit about that story and your relationship with Agnes Martin, and how, if at all, it impacted your practice, or how you approach how you make your paintings?
Agnes was my friend. She became my friend, which I feel wonderful about. She was like a high Buddha. She was fantastic. How her work affected me long before I met her. So I met her already honoring her work. But she made work the way the birds make music. She just worked. Every day she worked. And even at the end of her life, she went to the studio. She drove herself in her Mercedes to the studio. And she was a scary driver. But she did that, and she lugged those paintings around. They were 5 feet square. And when she couldn't lift 5 feet, she made 4 feet. And one day she said, "Could you move this painting for me?" And it was such an honor. I was thrilled to touch her painting. And what I learned from her is to work every day.
Which you do, because I asked you if you were taking a break after this, and you said, no, I'm going to go back in the studio.
Yes, I like to be in the studio.
I think this is a good place to stop, and I'd like to thank you for having this conversation with me, and I'd like to open up the floor to any questions that anyone might have here.
Thank you for an amazing installation and for this conversation. You said that self-expression is not the purpose of art. What is?
Art.
We've got another question. That's it.
Agreed. Thanks so much for sharing a little bit about this project and some of the history of your work. I'm curious, as you set for yourself the parameter of exploration of color for the Hirshhorn's project, and you're very excited to get back into the studio, I'm wondering, throughout that process of creating these 30 paintings, was there anything that surprised you about color specifically, or gave you something that you want to interrogate further?
I was surprised how hard it is to have a color in your mind and then make that color. It's harder than I thought. And that some colors, even though I'm not colorblind, some colors are harder to see than others. I guess and they're not the same colors for everybody.
Well, and that's the beauty of the project, this idea that, and you've said it so eloquently, that every color wheel is different, and this is your color wheel.
Yes. Well, I'm not a scientist, so Newton's color wheel is not something I can do. Most of the color wheels in my book, Barb, are 7 to 14 colors, but because of the size of this gallery, each color I have is 7 colors, so it came to 30 colors. 30 canvases. In the traditional color wheel, they don't seem to go beyond 14, and they don't become the next color. Often there's just a line. The red ends and it's yellow. Then the yellow ends and it's green. They very rarely blend into each other the way that I did it. So it's different in that way. That for me, the red became orange, and the orange became yellow, and the yellow became green, slowly. Because to make the circle, I had to have 30 canvases.
Before we get to one more question, I want to mention the white and the black painting, because there were 28 paintings, then there were 30 paintings, then we were back to 28, and then a couple days before we came to create the paintings in your studio, there were 30 again. What made you finally decide to add the white and the black?
Because theoretically, black is a mixture of all the colors together, and white is too. It's easier in the studio to make black than make white, but theoretically. So I thought they would be, and they're apart from the other colors. They're at the entrance to the gallery.
Right, and there's a larger gap between the paintings.
Yeah.
We have another question?
Yeah, so I noticed upstairs that it's very controlled light, that the inner windows have been covered with a black scrim of some sort, and there's black wall, and that there's overhead light above the paintings. So I guess what I'm curious is about the control of your painting practice in your studio in terms of it's not natural light. Is that correct?
I have north light, halogen light, and fluorescent light in the studio. My studio is very badly lit. But to show the paintings, I wanted the lighting to be good. So we controlled the light a lot. Whenever I show paintings, I control the light. It can be one painting in a gallery situation or 30 paintings in the Hirshhorn. I always control the light when the painting is seen. This was hard to light because every color absorbs light differently, but they don't have a different bulb for every color. in any gallery, really.
So I was just curious if were there surprises in terms of suddenly seeing it in one kind of light as to actually having painted it in a multitude of lights?
Yes, there were.
I should also note
Okay.
that Gordon Bunshaft did not design those galleries for paintings. They were designed for small-scale sculpture or for no art at all, and so it is only because of Pat's persistence and our lighting team's willingness to really work that they shine
Yes.
so beautifully. Like I said, those galleries were not made for paintings, but we fooled Bunshaft in the end. I think we have time for one more question, if there's one more.
You spoke earlier of John Cage and Merce Cunningham, and we know about their visions of silence and action and movement. Can you comment on how that early recognition of Cage's work and Cunningham's work possibly or doesn't come into your paintings? As far
I
as
was
space?
impressed by chance means, the way they put together, made their work and put it together, particularly John. The idea of chance means impressed me.
Well, I think with that, I want to thank Pat for her time, and we have some time, and I hope everybody will go back upstairs into the galleries and take a look at her show again. Thank you very much.